But yeah, I just wanted to dive in. This is a topic that is very timely, just especially in the last month or two. This is what I get asked about more than just about anything right now. And so let's jump in and talk about building a rock solid agent discovery and governance strategy. So just a quick preview. We're going to cover the agent development lifecycle, so really understanding how it differs from the traditional software development lifecycle. We're going to talk about kind of the current state of agents in the enterprise in February of 2026. Then how do you discover agents as they're growing and exploding across the enterprise? And then finally, how you implement that rock solid governance strategy once you've discovered it all. So let's jump in. Most people probably on this call are familiar with the traditional software development lifecycle process. This has been something that's been well understood for the last couple of decades and very well honed. There's certainly been changes with agile methodologies over the years, but it starts with some version of requirements gathering, planning, designing, coding, testing, and then maintenance. And obviously you can iterate on this cycle over time as you go to improve. And it was a very relatively deterministic process. You would kind of scope out the capabilities you wanted. You had a rough idea of how long it would take to build them. Sometimes schedules slip, sometimes things take longer than you expect, but it was all relatively deterministic. Fast forward to 2026, and this is what the agent development lifecycle has looked like. This is what the framework we've put together with, many engagements, building out successfully delivering a lot of systems with large enterprise clients. And it starts with similarly to a traditional software project where you have your planning and initial implementation. You really need to be able to, define what are the goals for the system, what behaviors do you want it to exhibit and support, and then really critically set up some sort of way to understand the baseline performance of it, like how well is it doing right now, so that as you're going through and iterating on it, you can really measure improvements. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. The next part, is the agent development flywheel. And so, in the first step, you've kind of put together an initial end-to-end flow. And that's one of the biggest differences from traditional software development. Just to get a piece of software up and running and have the basic data flows, that part comes together really quickly. And the reason is you're not spending as much time implementing very kind of prescriptive business logic. You're relying on the intelligence of agents to do that. And you kind of get that right out of the box with these agents. But the downside is that when you first put these systems up in place, when you first light them up, even if the data's flowing end to end, the results you get are oftentimes not very satisfactory right away. And so that's when you enter into the agent development flywheel. And so here you basically start using the system, and that can start in a lab. Over time, it can graduate into a set of control users before finally a full production rollout. But during that time, you're kind of observing the system. You're seeing where it does well, where it does poorly, and making tweaks to the prompts, to the context engineering strategy, the way you're retrieving data from vector DB, the way you're organizing your functionality into agents and tools. There's quite a lot of pieces that you're sitting there iterating. And this is the step where the importance of that the setting up the evals loop and the baseline becomes really important, right? Because if you have a comprehensive eval strategy here, this flywheel ends up working really well and going really quickly. If you're just relying on vibes to kind of make improvements, what ends up happening is progress really slows because as you go and make changes, you may fix one problem, but you may be introducing several more. And without a comprehensive evals framework in place, it just slows everything down and makes everything take a lot longer. And we have plenty of content on our site around setting up a good evals baseline, which I highly recommend. And then for today's call, the focus is going to be on this third phase, right? Which is as you go live, what are the things you need to do that in a sane way, in a way that guarantees that you get results and that also allows you to manage the risks that are inherent in any powerful technology. And so we're really going to focus on what you need to do as you're pushing this into production and going live to make sure that it's the win for your organization that it should be. So just to baseline on what where we're at in February 2026 with agents. Last year there was a real imperative to adopt agentic AI. There's a strong sense coming from CEOs and boards and C-suites and Wall Street and investors that if you're not adopting AI aggressively, then you're falling behind and you're going to get left behind. And there's well-founded reasons for that. I mean, there's plenty. We're watching businesses get disrupted left and right. And, but the plus side is enterprises that successfully navigate that are in a really good position because they already have tremendous scale. And if they can use AI to become more effective and more efficient, the rewards are felt immediately. So right now, what we're seeing is their agents are exploding from every vector. They're entering the enterprise from a number of different avenues. So this is, application developers, the teams of developers that are employed by enterprises as they're building new applications. They're building on different frameworks, adding agents into almost all new software projects these days are incorporating agentic AI somehow. Another way is there's a whole host of new solutions. So these are startups and tech companies that are developing solutions for things like, legal, helping legal professionals be more efficient, or helping finance professionals do a better job balancing books or cash flow forecasting, or customer service, making customer service a lot more efficient and a lot more effective and give better responses to users, all built on top of agents in the back end. And then the third avenue, and this one is in some ways the sneakiest in a way, is there's a lot of existing applications. So if you're using traditional applications like different like Salesforce or different ledger tools or financial tools, a lot of the people who make those applications, and you might have had them deployed in your environment for a decade or more, all of a sudden they're starting to put more and more agents under the hood and start to really kind of weave in agentic AI into these applications that have been deployed in enterprises for a long, long time. And so even if you're not pulling in any new software, even existing software with updates and patches, you're seeing more and more agents get deployed. And so what does this mean? It means like in 2026, people are going from, maybe dozens of agents running around their environment to thousands and tens of thousands and more. And these agents, without a good, like inventory of where they are, what they're doing, and a governance strategy, have the possibility to, certainly bring great results and great improvements, but also create some real risks that need to be managed. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So you guys have probably all heard, one of the big buzzwords last year was shadow AI. And shadow AI was focused on, what happened was a lot of times when ChatGPT first came out and Claude and Gemini, these tools that allowed you to like oftentimes help write docs or analyze large pieces of text. Many enterprises, there were certainly stories about people putting sensitive documents into these tools that were hosted by third parties, and that data being used for ways it shouldn't have been used, right? So that could have been, for training models or for all sorts of other things. And so, there was a big concern around shadow AI, which is oftentimes where an enterprise would block access to some of these services, but people might use it on a personal device or somehow access it through other means. And, I think people are starting to get control of that. In 2026, the concern is moving much more to these shadow agents, right? So agents that have been brought into the enterprise through the avenues that we talked about on the previous slide. And, enterprises don't really have a good handle on it's hard, where these agents are coming from. There's been such a rush to deploy and such a sense of urgency. And there's been so many different avenues that they work their way in that right now, all of a sudden, enterprises are realizing there's a bunch of agents deployed that they don't have good governance for. And so the first step is just discovering, what do we have, right? What's running where? What do I even have in my environment? And trying to do that manually is not a winning game. And so what are the techniques I can do to make sure that anytime a new agent works its way into my enterprise, hopefully it comes through goes through the right governing bodies. But if it doesn't, it's going to be detected and it's going to be flagged. And then I can make sure that, all the things you'd want to do, like make sure there's an accountable owner, make sure you have the appropriate guardrails. We'll talk about, what are those things you want to do. But the first step is just finding the agents that are in your environment. And we'll talk about how we do that, but it's not a simple thing. So at Arthur, we look at a number of different strategies for automating the discovery of these agents, but I'm going to highlight four that are probably the most common ones right now. The first one is telemetry, right? And so the industry is really coalescing around OTel as a standard for telemetry coming from agents. And that's been a really helpful trend in the industry. And I think what people are, the more forward-leaning enterprises we work with, and certainly one of the first recommendations we make with our customers and people we talk to is come up with a standard way to collect OTel and have a standard enterprise-wide for the telemetry stream for the telemetry coming off your agents. And so, we have listeners that basically listen to these OTel streams and look for new agents, new tools, changes in configurations, things like that, and can really infer quite a lot of detail from the standard OTel streams that are coming off of agents. So that's the first way. Second way is MCP monitoring. So as MCP stands for Model Context Protocol. It's kind of the agent equivalent of APIs. It's a way to provide endpoints that do a lot better with sort of unstructured reasoning. And so MCP servers are a way to expose agents and tools to other agents and tools so that they can be called as needed by different applications. And so by monitoring the MCP servers, finding new ones that are popping up in your environment and monitoring the existing one to see if new agents are coming online or there's any changes being made, you can flag a lot of new agents that way. Third one is around network layer analysis. So if you have, sometimes people proxy their LLM traffic through a proxy. Sometimes it's just through, general network traffic analysis. You can spot new usage of LLMs and of agents and tools that way and begin to get a handle on and detect new agents and tools and AI usage coming into your environment through network layer analysis. And then the fourth one, and this one's emerging, and it's one we're actively pushing people who make agent frameworks to do a better job at. But it's API-driven discovery. So if you're running, let's say, AWS Bedrock or GCP Vertex, or any number of a CrewAI or different platforms for agent building, most of them they're starting to put in place API hooks that can advertise a list of what's running and give you some degree of visibility that way. And so I think this one's going to grow, but you can't count on it being 100%. And that's why you really need to have this multi-layered strategy with a minimum of these four techniques. So let's take a little bit closer look at this is what it looks like. This is a real world example of how it looks in the Arthur dashboard. So you can see here, this is just a list of all the AI applications, and they could be running in GCP or AWS or really any environment. We have a federated structure that allows you to monitor across different environments. And they could be traditional ML or agentic or guardrails or generative. And then down at the bottom here, you'll see a list of unregistered agents. And these are the agents that maybe have been detected by one of those four techniques we're talking about that have not really been assigned to an application. And so if you have one of these, I'm going to pause for a second. If you have one of these agents, what you can do there is you can easily kind of go through and say, okay, this is part of an application. Here's the application it's part of. Here's the accountable owner. Here are the guardrails that should be in place. So we'll talk in more detail about that. But it just makes the whole thing very actionable and very easy to implement. And there you are. So now the unregistered agents have been organized into an application that can now be governed. All right. So once you've found all the agents running on in your environment, and that's a continuous thing because new ones pop up every single day. But once you found them, what do we do next? And we kind of alluded a little bit to the at the end of that video, but what does it mean to take them from just a bunch of unregistered agents into a well-governed agentic AI application? So let's talk more about governance right now. I think that there's people are starting to think a lot about it, but there's some problems plaguing the environment, plaguing it right now. Um, Biggest one is lack of policy for agents. So most organizations are still trying to figure out how they should govern agentic AI applications. They know they need to. And by the way, one of the really interesting distinctions with governance here is we're seeing a lot more interest in what's called first line governance. So, as opposed to like a traditional second line, governance function, which is a compliance organization, followed by third line governance, which is an audit function. Um, there's still a lot of interest at that second and third line, which has always traditionally been a strong part of most enterprises. But where we're seeing a real growth is first line, which is the application teams themselves saying, "Oh my gosh, I don't feel comfortable putting this into production without the right guardrails, without monitoring for the right things, without making sure I have the right data access controls in place." And so, you know, it's not like this is not just like theoretical risks with these things. These are very, very real risks that people are contending with and application developers worry about every single day. So having a lack of standardized policies for agents, that's the first hurdle. Policy fragmentation. So given that a lot of this is occurring in the first line in the application teams, there's tends to be fragmented approaches where people kind of custom implement some guardrails or some solutions for their particular application, but then it doesn't roll up into any sort of centralized reporting or standards or policies or anything like that. Um, Relatedly, if you're not careful, you can come up with governance that works for one platform or one type of agent, but is not agnostic enough to work across all the major providers of agent toolkits and all the different CSPs and different environments like that. So you need to make sure that anything you develop is kind of cross-platform, cross-framework. And then the last one is, avoiding one size fits all. So having a platform that allow a lot of the governance policies that you need to implement if you, are very use case specific. And so if you think about like how you might manually monitor, let's say a customer service agent, as a human supervisor, even if they were human customer service agents, you would want to make sure that, hey, are they doing a good job answering a customers' questions? Are they being friendly? Are they representing our brand well? All of these type of things that wouldn't apply to maybe other back office systems. And so you need to have a system where you can implement these policies in a very customizable use case specific way. And we'll go look at some examples of that to make it clearer. So I mentioned the customer service one. Let's go into a little more detail. So imagine a customer support agent for a large airline where you can book, cancel, get refunds on your tickets. What are some of the policies you'd want to have in place? Well, you'd want to make sure that you have some common sense guardrails first. So think about like you don't want PII coming out of the system. Maybe you don't want it going into the system. You certainly don't want any toxic language coming out of the system. And toxicity can actually have much more subtle forms, right? And so think about an HR app maybe shouldn't be talking about someone's family status or things like that. And so it's not always just inappropriate language. Um, Hallucinations, always want to check for hallucinations. If you're telling customers the wrong answer, that's certainly a problem. And then prompt injection, which is the most common form of security attack from malicious users, is one that generally our customers just apply across the board. And then some example evaluators. And so think of these as like your human supervisor agents that are just running and listening to all the conversations and making sure that the system's doing a good job. And so, is it responding with a friendly tone? Is it following brand guidelines? Is it correctly answering questions? These are all the same types of thing that a human supervisor may do, but that don't scale to, millions of interactions the way that you can if you automate this properly. And then finally, just making sure that you have good visibility into what these agents have access to, these AI agents. Can they access sensitive data that they shouldn't have access to? Can they update systems that they shouldn't be updating? What are they allowed to do? Because a lot of times if permissions are too broad, it can create quite a lot of risk. Another example here. So this is more of a back office example. This is an inventory management agent for a warehouse. Um, some of the guardrails are similar. You don't have to worry so much about toxicity and things like that, but hallucination, certainly prompt injection, you'll care about that. And an example of an evaluation, oftentimes when you're dealing with structured data, you have an agentic AI system that deals with structured data like inventory. Then there's step or multiple steps that generate SQL from natural language from a request. And so, you can have evaluators saying how good of a job is it doing generating accurate SQL. That's one that's really common that we see a lot and we deploy a lot. And then similarly there, you want to make sure you have the right access management policy so that your agents aren't improperly updating systems that they shouldn't have, and which could really throw things for a loop. And then third and final example, we'll just talk through a healthcare EHR agent for patient intake at a hospital. And so guardrails there around PII and there's a PII that you definitely need in a medical context, and there may be some that you don't want in there. Like maybe you don't want someone's credit card record entering their EHR data, so you need to be able to have very customizable PII blockage. Same thing around toxicity. One of the examples of making sure that these are highly customizable guardrails that we see in place is, medical record. You talk about certain things that may be inappropriate to talk about it with an airline customer service rep, and so you need to make sure you build, if you're talking about being injured or being, or like blood or something like that, totally appropriate in the context of a hospital, not so appropriate in the context of an airline customer service representative. And so those are examples of like how these guardrails need to be customized and the policies need to be customized for different use cases in different industries. And then similar evaluators around, making sure that there's clinical accuracy, factual consistency, things like that are really important. And then access management, obviously with HIPAA and the regulations in the medical field, brings a whole nother set of considerations that you need to make sure that there's automated governance policies to enforce. So when we talk about agent governance strategies, these are like the musts: a unified policy framework that is consistent across an entire enterprise, doesn't let things fall through the cracks. Agnostic governance, so making sure that no matter the use case, no matter the stack, no matter the platform, that it works. And then those highly customizable policies, because every application is going to have different requirements. And with traditional human-based governance, humans are very good at adapting from one use case to another. And you need to have, as you automate more of the work and you automate more of the oversight and the governance, you need to make sure you have an equally adaptable governance automation in place. So here's just another example of how that looks. So this would be, adding some, here you can see some of the evaluator policies that are in place to make sure that nothing goes off the rails. And so this is an example of a developer or a product owner or a compliance person going in and just checking to make sure that everything's in compliance. Within some of the evaluator policies we talked about, you can go and set those up, make sure they're configured properly, configure things like alerting if any of the policies are violated, so that when problems happen, and making all that highly configurable. And then of course, as we talked about, being able to customize things like different notions of toxicity that are use case specific, and monitoring for hallucination, things like that. Just making that really easy so it scales to the thousands and increasingly tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of agents that are running across a large enterprise. And as I've mentioned, this has gone from maybe 6 months ago, something people were worried about as mostly a theoretical, like they saw it coming. It has arrived, and we're already seeing. McKinsey did a big report. This is 3 or 4 months ago. They were highlighting that already they're getting 80% of their enterprises report seeing risky behaviors. And there's a lot of headlines right now, and they're only increasing. So uh, important thing to get to jump on while it's still manageable and before real significant issues arise. Um, we are going to jump in. I know there were some questions in the chat, so hopefully that was helpful. Um, First question I got was, how do I integrate an agent with the Arthur eval monitoring system? I have an agent deployed to an EC2 with access via fast API. Getting to the stage where we want to have evals, hadn't had a chance to go through the documentation yet. Yeah, I mean, so we have native integrations with AWS and all the major CSPs, and that's absolutely something. I think our CTO Zach has office hours, and he can probably get you up and running with that in like 20 minutes if you jump into that. Feel free to send us a message, and we'll get you. We'll make sure you get squared up, and we can have you up and running very quickly.
Yeah, so if you just respond to any of the webinar emails or like just email us at team@arthur.ai, we'll get you hooked up and get you those office hours links. I guess we have another question also from John, which is I'm looking for approaches to using the principles of RBAC for unstructured data, specifically anything we put in the context window based on identity and role of an agent.
Yeah, so this is a very good question, and one that number one would probably also be better suited for some of the members of our technical team. But it's a huge issue, right? When you populate supervised data. One of the interesting things that we look at, we didn't talk a lot about this, but one of the guardrails that we really like to implement with our customers is kind of an AI based version of data access, sensitive data controls. And so, a lot the electronic health record one is a good example, right? So there's some systems where you may want to feed in even like really sensitive data, but you don't want the system returning it, but you want to use it to reason. And so an example of this is saying like, hey, what's the most common condition associated with high blood pressure, right? Or the most common symptom associated with that. You want to be able the system to have access to full details for that, but you don't necessarily want it to be able to some person who doesn't have the appropriate permissions to be able to say, all right, what conditions does Adam have, right, and return individual data. And so, like just the notion of like kind of traditional data security, where you're sort of saying these columns and these rows in the database, you need to have these permissions RBAC. In some use cases, that doesn't even hold up. Um, but there are definitely techniques for managing that. Like if you want to have as you're building your vector data store of data that you're feeding with the agents, how you kind of control which agents can see what on a more declarative basis can be done. And happy to put you in touch with people to talk in more detail about that.
Cool. Yeah, if you have any other questions, feel free to put it in. I think there's a last question right here. Which is it's from Daniel. Can you explain again how the ADLC approach differs from the software dev life cycle?
Yeah, sure. I want to pop back to that slide. The main thing is, with traditional software development lifecycle, when you get to basically you kind of design it all up front, you build it all up front, and by the time you get, and then once it's kind of like all hooked up and built out end to end, um, you're usually like 95% of the way there. There's certainly some bugs, some things to improve, but like it's generally working pretty well. That 1.0. Whereas with agents, that's not the case. With agents, you can kind of get it running end to end pretty quickly and get it like spitting out good answers a fraction of the time pretty immediately. But then kind of taking that and going from like, hey, it's right 80% of the time to it's right 99.8% of the time, which is good enough to go into production. That's where the majority of your time investment is. And so it's kind of taking that mindset of like, I can get something like up and running. And the symptom we see all the time is that people put together demos very quickly and they get very excited. And then when it becomes time to, they get like greenlit to take that from a demo to production, they end up really struggling. And it's because they don't have the right mindset, and also they haven't invested a small amount of time to setting up the right degree of testing and evaluating to really accelerate this flywheel part. Because it just turns out that all the different there's so many knobs and levers with prompts and with data and with um, the way you kind of decompose your system into agents and tools and things like that and as you're going through they have very subtle but significant interactions, and there's lots of knobs and levers, and if you don't have like a rational kind of effective framework in place for making those improvements, then you get bogged down there. But the flip side is if you do have that rational kind of evals framework and baseline in place, if you invest a little bit of time up front to do that, it pays huge dividends and it really gets you to a great result much more quickly. And then actually the last piece too, around the governance and discovery, one of the big differences is that these systems aren't static. It's like if you're using like any of the major model providers like OpenAI or Anthropic, like they're changing the models under the hood all the time. And so new behaviors emerge, things get parts of the system kind of get better for free. Sometimes it introduces regressions. We've definitely encountered that plenty of times. And so having like a really good governance in place, also as people who are using your system discover maybe more additional uses of it, like, oh, I didn't know the agent could do that. A lot of times those are things that maybe the developers didn't have in mind when they built it. And so having some sort of governance in place can oftentimes, give you, let you know if someone's using it for a system it wasn't designed for and may not be working very well for, or at least not consistently enough.
That's that's awesome. Yeah, and we have one more question, which is, since there's a ton of agent building and orchestration tools out there, does it make sense to restrict the tools engineering teams are allowed to use to just a specific subset of them for better purposes for better governance purposes? Is there, yeah.
Yeah, that's a classic enterprise technique, and there is certainly some wisdom to it. My advice is we're still a little bit early for that. Like these frameworks are, there's new ones emerging all the time still, and they're changing very rapidly. And so, I think 5 years from now, will that standardization make sense? Potentially, potentially. But right now, I think if you try to standardize and don't let people experiment with new frameworks and use you're going to miss out on a lot of learning, and it's going to slow you down too much, and you're going to set yourself back. So right now, I think uh, the that kind of ability to try the newest ones and make sure, because you get like the a lot of these new ones are coming out. They have significant advantages that you want to take advantage of, and so you don't want to cut that off yet. But there may come a time when the frameworks kind of stabilize a little bit, the rate of innovation slows, and at that point it could make it more efficient to standardize. We're not there yet.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah, I think that's about it. We have a bunch of thank yous in the question answer because I unfortunately didn't enable the chat. But yeah, thank you all for joining. And yeah, feel free to shoot us an email if you have any questions, or feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn. Happy to book time and work with y'all. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.